The Mediterranean sun rose like a wound over Crete on the morning of May 22nd, 1941, painting the smoking ruins of Malemi airfield in shades of crimson and ash. Bodies, both Allied and German, littered the landscape like discarded dolls, and the acrid smell of cordite mixed with the sweet scent of wild thyme growing between the rocks. This was the second day of the German invasion, and for Captain Charles Upham and his 21 exhausted New Zealanders, it would be the day that separated the living from the dead, the ordinary from the legendary. But none of them knew that yet. What they knew was this: somewhere to the east, 140 men from B Company were trapped, surrounded on three sides by German forces, slowly being compressed into an ever-tightening noose. What they knew was that between their shallow trench and B Company's desperate position lay three machine gun nests, expertly positioned, heavily fortified, and manned by battle-hardened German paratroopers who had already slaughtered two previous Allied attempts to break through. What they knew was that they had been ordered to withdraw. And what Charles Upham knew, with the cold certainty of a shepherd who can smell a storm hours before it arrives, was that if they obeyed that order, every single man in B Company would be dead by nightfall. In the trench, Private Jenkins, barely 20 years old with fear bright in his eyes, whispered to Upham that perhaps the Germans had moved on after 6 hours of silence. Maybe they had abandoned their positions. Maybe it was safe. Upham didn't even glance at the boy. However, his blue eyes remained fixed on the ridge ahead, and in a voice barely above a murmur, he told Jenkins that the Germans hadn't moved at all. When Jenkins asked how he could possibly know that, Upham simply said he could smell them: German cigarettes, Turkish tobacco, carried on the northwest wind. He pointed to three clusters of rocks, 200 meters distant, and with the precise economy of a man who wasted neither words nor movements, he identified the exact locations of the enemy machine gun positions. They were waiting, he explained, for the New Zealanders to break cover, waiting to cut them down like wheat. It was then that Sergeant Ryan arrived, crawling through the dirt with a message from battalion headquarters. The order was clear: withdraw immediately to the new defensive line. Fall back, survive to fight another day. Upham's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He asked Ryan a simple question: if they withdrew and the Germans took this flank, what would happen to B Company? The sergeant didn't need to answer. They both understood the arithmetic of death. He pressed the point: how many men were trapped in B Company? 140, Ryan replied. Maybe less after the night's fighting. And how many did they have here? 21 men, the sergeant said quietly. They had lost Harrison and Webb during the dark hours. Upham closed his eyes for just a moment, and when he opened them again, something had changed. Something cold and final had settled behind those blue eyes, like ice forming on a high country stream. 21 men, he said, would have to be enough. He gathered his men in the trench, these exhausted, filthy soldiers who looked at him with the hollow eyes of men who had already written their own epitaphs. Upham laid out the situation with brutal honesty. B Company was pinned down 800 meters to the east. If the New Zealanders withdrew, the Germans would push through the gap and surround those trapped men. If B Company was surrounded, they would be annihilated. It was mathematics, pure and simple. Corporal Matthews, his voice edged with bitter humor, pointed out the obvious. If they stayed, they would be the ones getting annihilated. Upham acknowledged this with a single word, perhaps. The men didn't know whether to laugh or cry at his understatement, but then he explained why they weren't all going to die, and in that explanation, the sheep farmer from Canterbury revealed the tactical genius that would make him a legend. He described the three machine gun nests on the ridge with clinical precision. They were dug in, well supplied, with clear fields of fire in every direction. A frontal assault would be suicide. Absolute suicide, which was exactly why they weren't going to do a frontal assault. Kneeling in the dirt, he drew a crude map with his finger, marking the enemy positions and the obvious approaches: the road, the stream bed, the open ground. The Germans would be watching all of these, their machine guns zeroed in, waiting. But then he tapped a spot on his improvised map and revealed what he had seen that no one else had noticed. Dead ground. A dry irrigation ditch, overgrown with scrub and wild grass, that ran to within 50 meters of the German position. Private Jenkins, his voice cracking slightly, pointed out that 50 meters was still terrifyingly far from the enemy. Upham looked at him with those ice-blue eyes and said simply that 50 meters wasn't far at all, if you were quiet enough. Sergeant Ryan understood immediately what Upham was proposing, and the incredulity in his voice was unmistakable. The captain was planning to crawl 50 meters under the Germans' noses? Upham corrected him with characteristic precision. They were all going to crawl 50 meters under the Germans' noses. 6 men volunteered to go with Upham, Ryan, Jenkins, Matthews, and 3 others whose names would be remembered by their families but forgotten by history. They moved in single file through the irrigation ditch, crawling through vegetation that provided cover but felt desperately inadequate. Every rustle of cloth, every displaced stone, every labored breath seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Upham led from the front, his lean body moving with the practiced silence of a man who had spent years stalking through the Canterbury high country, approaching nervous sheep without startling them. His eyes never stopped moving, reading the terrain the way other men read books, seeing patterns and possibilities invisible to ordinary observers. Sweat dripped from his face despite the early morning coolness, but his movements remained fluid, controlled, almost meditative. Then they heard the voices. German voices, so close they could make out individual words. Someone laughed at a joke. Someone else complained about the heat. There was the distinctive metallic click of a rifle being cleaned, a sound that made every New Zealander freeze in place. Jenkins stopped moving entirely, paralyzed by terror, convinced that the next sound he heard would be the bark of German rifles ending his life. But Upham looked back at him, caught his gaze, and slowly, deliberately, put a finger to his lips. It wasn't a command barked by a superior officer. It was a reminder from one man to another. Stay calm, stay quiet, stay alive. They continued crawling, measuring their progress in inches rather than feet. The ditch began to narrow, forcing them into even closer proximity to the enemy position. Upham held up a closed fist and everyone became absolutely still, barely daring to breathe. Not 20 meters away, a German soldier emerged from his position, unbuttoning his trousers to relieve himself. He was whistling a tune, something cheerful and civilian and grotesquely out of place on this blood-soaked island. When the New Zealanders lay like stones, their hearts hammering so loudly they were certain the German would hear. One wrong move, one cough, one inadvertent sound, and they would all die in this forgotten ditch on this forgotten island. The German finished his business, buttoned up, and walked back to his position, still whistling. Upham waited. 5 seconds. 10. 15. When he was absolutely certain the danger had passed, he moved forward again, and the others followed. Men who now understood that their captain wasn't just brave, he was something else entirely. Something beyond ordinary courage. They reached the end of the ditch as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. They were now in a small depression, hidden by scrub, roughly 40 meters from the first machine gun nest. They could hear the Germans with crystal clarity now. On a casual conversation about families back home, complaints about officers, the mundane banter of soldiers who believed themselves safe behind fortified positions. Upham signaled his men to spread out along the depression. Each man took a position, and they watched as their captain pulled out his grenades and checked them one by one with the careful attention a craftsman gives to his tools. Matthews, his voice barely audible, whispered that they were actually going to do this insane thing. Upham confirmed that yes, they were actually going to do this insane thing. He looked at each man in turn, his gaze lingering on their faces as if memorizing them, and then he gave his instructions with absolute clarity. When he threw the first grenade, they were to count to 3, then throw theirs, not before, not after, exactly 3 seconds. Ryan asked what would happen after they threw their grenades, and Upham told them they would run like hell toward the second position. He pulled the pin on his first grenade and spoke words that would echo in the memories of those survivors for the rest of their lives. He told them this was for B Company, for the 140 men whose lives depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Then he stood up and threw. Time seemed to slow as the grenade arced through the blue Mediterranean sky. The Germans in the first nest saw it coming, their faces transforming from boredom to confusion to pure terror in the span of a heartbeat. The explosion tore through their position with devastating force, Smoke and screams erupting from what had been, seconds before, a place of casual conversation and false security. 1, 2, 3. 6 more grenades flew through the air like vengeful angels, and the first machine gun position ceased to exist. Before the smoke had even begun to clear, Upham was already moving, shouting for his men to follow, sprinting across open ground toward the second position with bullets kicking up dirt around their feet. The German machine gunners in the second nest swung their weapon toward these madmen, charging across the killing ground. One of Upham's men, Private Talbot, a farmer's son from Otago, went down, hit in the chest. He was dead before he hit the ground, but there was no time to mourn, no time to stop, no time for anything except forward movement. Upham ran directly at the muzzle flash of the machine gun, not in a straight line but zigzagging with the instincts of a man who understood how predators hunt. He carried grenades in both hands, and the Germans in the nest could see him coming, this lean figure in a dirty uniform, running at them with what looked like absolute disregard for his own life. They swung the MG-42 to track him, their training overcoming their shock at this suicidal assault. But Upham dove forward, rolled through the dust, and came up already throwing. His grenade landed with perfect precision in the center of their position, and the explosion silenced the machine gun forever. But not before one final burst tore through the air. Upham staggered. His hand went instinctively to his side and came away red. He looked at the blood with an expression of mild curiosity, as if this were an interesting but not particularly important development. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his ribs, and he could feel the wet heat of blood spreading across his uniform. Sergeant Ryan reached him, breathless and horrified, shouting that the captain was hit and needed medical attention immediately. Upham acknowledged that yes, he was aware of being wounded, then pressed a field dressing against the injury with his free hand and pointed toward the third position, 100 meters distant behind a stone wall. Ryan grabbed his arm and told him he needed to get to the rear, to the field hospital, that he could barely stand. But Upham pulled away and explained with terrible logic that B Company was still pinned down, still dying, and that meant he could stand perfectly well. When Ryan invoked orders and regulations, Upham said something that would later be repeated in mess halls and veterans gatherings for decades. He said that orders were sometimes stupid, and this was one of those times. They approached the final position with 5 men now, having left Talbot's body in the dust behind them. This position was different from the first 2, more elaborate, better fortified, with stone walls and overhead cover. This wasn't a hasty defensive position thrown together by paratroopers. This was a proper fortification that could withstand artillery. Matthews studied it with a tactical eye and announced what they all could see. They couldn't flank it because it had clear sight lines in every direction. They were going to have to go through the front door. Upham, his breathing growing labored as blood loss took its toll. He studied the fortification with the same intense focus he had brought to every moment of this terrible morning. Jenkins asked what he meant by the front door, and Upham pointed to a small gap in the stone wall, perhaps 2 feet wide, and explained that they would enter single file, with him going first. Sergeant Ryan said, with great respect, that this plan was absolutely insane. Upham agreed that yes, it was insane, which was precisely why the Germans wouldn't expect it. He checked his remaining grenades, 4 left, and told his men that when he was inside the position, he would create confusion. When they heard the first explosion, they were to come through fast and hard. The men nodded, though their faces showed they believed they were about to watch their captain die. Upham gave Ryan final instructions. If he didn't make it through, the sergeant was to get the remaining men back to safety and find some way to save B Company. Ryan confirmed he understood, his voice thick with emotion. Then Upham said something strange, something that seemed completely out of place in this moment of violence and desperation. He told them that grenades were like sheep. You didn't chase them, you guided them where they needed to go. The men had no idea what he meant, but there was something in his eyes, some connection to his previous life as a shepherd in the quiet Canterbury Hills, that made the statement feel profound, even if incomprehensible. He moved toward the gap in the wall, crouching low, his movements still silent despite his wound. Through the narrow opening, he could see 4 German soldiers, all of them focused outward, scanning for threats from the obvious directions. Now they had no idea death was about to arrive from an impossible angle. Upham reached the gap and paused, his hand moving to one of his grenades with the careful deliberation of a man who knew this might be his last action on Earth. He pulled the pin and counted. 1, 2, then tossed the grenade underhand through the gap. But he didn't throw it at the soldiers. He threw it at the back of the position, where it bounced and rolled into the far corner. The Germans saw the grenade and reacted exactly as Upham had predicted they would. They scrambled away from it, instinct overcoming training, moving directly toward the gap where he waited. As the grenade exploded and the soldiers instinctively turned toward the blast, Upham stepped through the gap and threw his second grenade at point-blank range into their midst. And the explosion in that confined space was catastrophic. Upham staggered through the smoke, pulling his service pistol with his one good hand. The other was barely functioning now, the wound in his side having spread numbness through his left arm. A German soldier emerged from the smoke, rifle raised, but Upham fired first. Another wounded German reached for a weapon on the ground, and Upham shot him too. Behind him, Ryan and the others poured through the gap, finishing the brutal work of clearing the position. When the smoke cleared and the shooting stopped, Upham was leaning against the stone wall, breathing in ragged gasps. Blood pooled at his feet, dark and spreading. Ryan called out that the position was secure, and Upham nodded, unable to speak. The sergeant shouted for a medic, his voice cracking with urgency. But Upham grabbed his arm with surprising strength and forced out 2 words: B Company. Ryan told him they would signal B Company immediately, that they had done what they came to do, that it was over. But Upham raised his hand and pointed east with a trembling finger. Through the gun smoke and morning haze, they could all see the nightmare approaching. German infantry, at least 50 of them, advancing in formation toward B Company's position. The breakthrough had bought time, but it hadn't won the battle. Upham gave an order that seemed to come from the last reserves of his failing strength. He told them to turn the gun around. Matthews and Jenkins wrestled with the captured MG-42, swinging the heavy weapon 180 degrees to face the advancing Germans. Matthews shouted that he didn't know how to operate German equipment, and Jenkins told him to figure it out fast because they were out of time. Upham slid down beside them, his uniform soaked with blood, his face the color of old paper. But his hands were steady as he grabbed the machine gun and checked the belt feed mechanism with practiced efficiency. He showed Matthews where the charging handle was, where the trigger was, how to fire in short bursts. He told the terrified corporal to aim for the officers first, the ones with binoculars. Ryan tried one more time to get his captain to fall back for medical treatment, and Upham said he would go after they finished this one last thing. The sergeant understood then that Upham wasn't going to survive this day, that he had known it from the moment the shrapnel tore through his ribs, and that he was determined to spend what remained of his life making sure B Company lived. Upham looked at his remaining men, 5 faces, exhausted and terrified, and still with him despite everything, and told them they had all done brilliantly. He said that when they told this story later, and they would tell it because they would survive, they should remember that it wasn't courage that won the day. It was just sheep farming. The men looked at him in confusion, and for the first time that terrible morning, Upham almost smiled. He explained that you didn't push a flock of sheep where you wanted them to go. You guided them where they thought they wanted to go, and then you surprised them at the end. He looked at the advancing Germans and said quietly that it was time to surprise them. Matthews opened fire. The captured machine gun tore into the German advance with devastating effect. Soldiers fell, officers with binoculars crumpled, and the organized formation began to dissolve into chaos. But there were too many of them, and they were too well trained. They began to flank, to spread out, to apply the same tactical principles that Upham had used against their comrades. Upham watched with eyes that were growing dim, but his tactical mind still functioned with crystal clarity. He ordered Ryan to take Jenkins and Matthews to a gully 30 meters west to set up a crossfire that would catch the Germans in a lethal triangle. Ryan protested that this would leave Upham with only 2 men to hold the main position, and Upham responded that 2 excellent men would be sufficient. Ryan hesitated, and Upham tried to invoke his authority as an officer, but the words came out wrong, interrupted by a cough that brought blood to his lips. The sergeant caught him as he swayed, and Upham told him weakly that he expected his orders to be followed. Ryan grabbed Jenkins and Matthews and moved to the flanking position, leaving Upham with two young privates, Donovan and Shire, who looked at their dying captain with a mixture of terror and awe. Upham told them calmly what they were going to do next, as if this were a training exercise rather than a last stand. The battle escalated into a crescendo of violence. The Germans were taking fire from two directions now, and their advance stalled as they tried to identify the flanking position. But in the distance, a new sound emerged that made every New Zealander's heart sink: the grinding roar of tank engines. Two Panzer IIIs appeared on the horizon, their massive forms grinding across the rocky ground toward the New Zealand positions. Private Donovan, his voice rising to near hysteria, shouted that they had armor, that it was over, that grenades couldn't stop tanks. Upham acknowledged this was not ideal, his voice remarkably calm for a man who was bleeding to death. He checked his remaining grenades, two left, and Shire reminded him desperately that grenades wouldn't penetrate tank armor. Upham agreed that this was correct. Grenades would not penetrate armor. But then he explained, with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow student, that tank commanders had to open their hatches to see properly. And when they did that, you could guide the grenade where it needed to go. The Panzers ground closer with inexorable mechanical certainty. 100 meters, 75, 50. Upham waited, standing perfectly still despite the blood that now dripped steadily from his wound, creating a small pool at his feet. His blue eyes tracked the lead tank with the same focus he had once used to watch distant sheep moving across Canterbury hillsides. The lead tank commander, needing a better view of the battlefield, opened his hatch and stood up in the cupola. It was the mistake Upham had been waiting for. He stood up himself, swaying dangerously, and steadied himself against the stone wall. He pulled the pin on his second-to-last grenade. He counted 1, 2, and threw. The grenade arced through the air with perfect precision. It had the result of a lifetime of throwing things accurately across distances, of guiding sheep with thrown stones, of understanding trajectory and wind and timing in a way that came not from training, but from years of practice in a completely different context. The tank commander saw it too late. The grenade dropped through the open hatch like a coin into a slot. The muffled explosion that followed sent smoke pouring from every opening in the tank. The massive machine lurched to a stop, transformed in an instant from an instrument of destruction to a metal tomb. The second tank commander, witnessing the fate of his comrade, threw his Panzer into reverse, but machine gun fire from Ryan's flanking position raked its tracks. The tank slewed sideways, immobilized, its crew scrambling to escape. The German infantry, each seeing their armor disabled and caught in a crossfire they couldn't escape, began to withdraw. Not routed, these were professional soldiers, but definitely pulling back, reassessing, deciding that this position was too costly to take. The firing died down gradually like a storm passing, until finally there was only the sound of wind across the rocks and the distant cries of wounded men. The Germans were falling back to regroup, and the immediate threat was over. Upham slid down the wall into a sitting position, his back against the stone, his face the color of ash. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, and his hands had begun to shake. Sergeant Ryan sprinted back from the flanking position, triumphing in his eyes at their impossible victory. But when he saw Upham, the triumph transformed instantly to horror. He screamed for a medic, his voice breaking with desperation. But Upham interrupted him with a question asked in barely a whisper. He wanted to know about B Company. Were they all right? Were they safe? Ryan told him that yes, he could see them. They were still holding their position. Because of what Upham had done, they were going to survive. Upham nodded and closed his eyes, and Ryan grabbed his shoulder and told him to stay awake. The sergeant, tears now streaming down his dirt-covered face, said that was an order. Upham opened one eye and, with a ghost of his characteristic dry humor, said he thought he was the one who gave orders. Ryan told him not anymore, not today. A medic arrived and began working with frantic urgency, cutting away blood-soaked cloth, applying pressure, doing everything a field medic could do with limited supplies in an active combat zone. He announced what everyone could see. Upham had lost a catastrophic amount of blood and needed to be evacuated immediately. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, Upham grabbed Ryan's arm with what little strength remained. He asked about his men. Ryan told him that Talbot was dead, but the rest were alive because of what their captain had done. Upham's grip loosened, and he said something that the survivors would remember and repeat for the rest of their lives. He told Ryan not to say it was because of him. It was because of what they had all done together. His eyes closed, and for a terrible moment, Ryan thought he had lost him. But then he felt a faint pulse in Upham's wrist, and he knew his captain was still fighting. Later that afternoon, mounted in a field hospital set up in a commandeered house several kilometers from the front, Upham lay on a cot, bandaged and pale but miraculously alive. A doctor checked his wound and told him he was a lucky man. Another inch to the left and the shrapnel would have hit his liver, and no field hospital in Crete could have saved him. Upham, his voice weak but his spirit unbroken, said he didn't feel particularly lucky. Through the tent opening, he could see soldiers from B Company moving past, over 100 of them, dirty and exhausted and traumatized, but alive. Alive because 21 men had refused an order to withdraw. Alive because one sheep farmer from Canterbury had understood that sometimes the only way to save a flock is to become a wolf. Private Jenkins appeared at the entrance and told Upham there were some men who wanted to see him. Upham, with genuine distress, said to tell them he was sleeping. Jenkins replied that there were about 50 of them outside, all from B Company, all wanting to thank the man who saved their lives. Upham tried to sit up, failed, and told Jenkins to inform them he had just been doing his job. Nothing special, nothing worthy of attention. Outside the tent, voices began calling his name, not in anger or demand, but in gratitude and wonder. The sound of men who understood they were supposed to be dead, and weren't, and knew exactly who to thank for that impossible gift. Upham looked mortified. This was his nightmare, not the Germans, not the bullets, not the grenades, but this, being celebrated, being singled out, it being made into something he knew he wasn't. He muttered something unprintable under his breath. As sunset painted the Mediterranean sky in shades of gold and purple, Sergeant Ryan sat beside Upham's cot after the crowd outside had finally dispersed. He told his captain that they were going to put him in for a medal for what he had done. Upham, with genuine anger, said they had better not. Ryan admitted he had already written the citation. Upham glared at him and pointed out that he had specifically ordered Ryan not to do that. The sergeant, with a small smile, reminded him that he had been unconscious at the time and therefore couldn't give valid orders. Despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the trauma, Upham almost smiled at that. Ryan asked the question he had been holding since morning. Why did Upham do it? Why did he risk everything for men he barely knew, following orders he thought were stupid, fighting battles he wasn't required to fight? Upham looked out at the sunset, his eyes distant, and he told Ryan about his life before the war, and about being a shepherd in Canterbury, in quiet hills with quiet sheep and a quiet life. He explained that war wasn't about being brave. War was about making sure someone got to go home to those quiet hills, to that quiet life that people like him had once known, and soldiers like those in B Company deserved to experience. He looked at Ryan with those blue eyes, dimmer now but still clear, and said that 140 men would get to go home eventually. Maybe, probably. That wasn't heroism, he said. That was just arithmetic. Simple mathematics. 21 men risking their lives to save 140. The equation is balanced. Ryan nodded, not fully understanding, but understanding enough. He told Upham that his arithmetic had saved those lives, and Upham corrected him one final time. Not his arithmetic, their arithmetic. He couldn't have done it alone. As night fell over Crete, Upham closed his eyes and asked Ryan to please let him sleep and to tell those men outside to go away. The sergeant left the tent, and in the darkness, a military clerk typed out a telegram recommending Captain Charles Upham for the Victoria Cross for conspicuous bravery and leadership under fire, resulting in the destruction of 3 enemy positions and the saving of approximately 140 Allied lives. Upham, asleep and unaware, would later call the events at Malem just doing my job. He would refuse to speak about his actions for the rest of his life. When awarded the Victoria Cross, he would insist it belonged to his men, not to him. He would earn a second Victoria Cross in Egypt the following year, one of only 3 people in history ever to receive the award twice. And he would be even more distressed by that recognition. After the war, he would return to his sheep farm in Canterbury and work in quiet anonymity until his death in 1994. He would refuse interviews, decline honors, and live out his days as he had always intended, as a shepherd in quiet hills, with quiet sheep, living a quiet life. But the 140 men of B Company never forgot. They remembered the morning when 21 men crawled through a ditch under enemy noses. They remembered grenades thrown with impossible precision. They remembered a captain who fought with one hand while his blood drained into foreign soil. They remembered a man who refused to be called a hero, who insisted that courage was just arithmetic, who believed that saving lives wasn't extraordinary, it was simply necessary. And on nights when old soldiers gathered to tell stories of the war, when the younger generation asked what made the difference between survival and death on that terrible island in the spring of 1941, the veterans of B Company would say the same thing. A shepherd who understood that sometimes, to save the flock, you have to fight like a wolf. Charles Upham spent 50 years trying to make the world forget his name. He refused medals, declined honors, and lived in quiet anonymity on his sheep farm until his death in 1994. But the 140 men he saved, they never forgot. Their children never forgot. Their grandchildren never forgot. And now neither will you. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, if you believe that true heroism isn't about seeking glory, but about doing what's necessary when no one else can, then don't let Charles Upham's wish to be forgotten come true. Share this story, hit that subscribe button, because the best way to honor a man who never wanted recognition is to make sure his sacrifice, his courage, and his humanity are never lost to history. The greatest heroes are the ones who never wanted to be called heroes. Let's remember them anyway.